Good evening, and welcome to our live stream presentation on Catholicism, social justice, and the elections. I'm Jane Myers, the Director of Formation and Pastoral Care for Bellarmine Chapel. We're happy to be co-sponsoring this event with Xavier University's Institute for Spirituality and Social Justice. Our goal this evening is to encourage open discussion of issues which are raised up by our Catholic social teaching. While Bellarmine remains a nonpartisan community, we do embrace our Catholic call to have an informed engagement in our political life. This evening, our panel will not be promoting a particular party or candidate. For this discussion, we have identified 3 issues which have become priorities for our Bellarmine community as well as for the Institute. These are racial justice, immigration justice, and climate justice. We will begin with hearing opening remarks from each of our panelists, followed by their responses to several prepared questions. Following those, if you are watching this live, please know that there will be time for question and answer. You can submit your questions at any time in the chat box to the right of this live stream, or by using the web form linked on the same page you visited to access this live stream. Just click the blue button that reads Submit a Question. We also want to offer thanks to Tim Severin, our Director of Social Mission, and our intern, Jonathan Hesford, both of whom are providing our tech support tonight. So thank you, Tim and Jonathan. And now it's my privilege to introduce our 3 panelists. Tracey Horan is a Sister of Providence of St. Mary of the Woods, Indiana, and Associate Director of Education and Advocacy for the Kino Border Initiative in Nogales, Sonora, Mexico, and Arizona. She has ministered with Latinx migrant communities in a variety of contexts for nearly a decade, and previously worked as a teacher and community organizer. Tracey recently celebrated 6 years as a religious sister. John Sniegocki is an associate professor of religious ethics and has taught on the theology faculty at Xavier's 1. His main areas of interest and publication include Catholic social teaching, globalization, economic ethics, war and nonviolence, grassroots social movements, ecology, food ethics, contemplative spirituality, and Buddhist Christian dialogue. John serves as director of Xavier University's Peace and Justice Studies minor. Reverend Deacon Royce Winters has been the director of the Archdiocese of Cincinnati's Office of African American Pastoral Ministries now since 2005, and has served as pastoral administrator for the Church of the Resurrection in Bond Hill since 2010. Royce also serves as chaplain for the Cincinnati Fire Department, and in his prior career worked in the Cincinnati Police Department for over 26 years in various law enforcement assignments. So thank you to all of you for being with us tonight. We are privileged to have you here on our panel. We've asked each of you to prepare a few minutes of an opening statement, opening remarks to give our audience a sense of who you are and what has formed and shaped your sense of Catholic social teaching and your own prophetic voices up to this point in your work. So I guess we can begin in the order that I introduced you. So Tracey, would you begin, please?
Sure, I'm happy to. Thanks so much. It's good to be with you all this evening, and I think it's really important that we're having this conversation. For me, when I think about the ways that I've been formed in understanding Catholic social teaching and making decisions about taking action in public life, I'm not sure that, some of the encounters I think of, I'm not sure that I necessarily would have connected them to Catholic social teaching at the time, but in retrospect, I can. The first such encounter that I think of when I was in high school, I remember being in my Spanish class, and we were having a debate. Our teacher was asking us to debate whether we should build a wall at the US-Mexico border. And at the time, I was very outspoken that, yes, we should build a wall. People are breaking the law and coming here, and it's a criminal act. And I was very clear. And so my teacher at that time was really smart, and she asked me to debate the other side of the issue, because it was pretty clear that I had a lot of background on the side that I was arguing. And so that was an important moment for me. It was the first time that I felt someone had asked me a question, had invited me to question my own assumptions about people that I hadn't encountered. And then later, after graduating college, I moved to El Paso, Texas area, and lived there for a couple of years. And I taught students. About a third of my students lived in Juarez, Mexico, and would cross every day to come to school. And so seeing firsthand the issues that my students were facing, the violence in Juarez, it kind of started to broaden my circle of people that I thought about and considered when discerning decisions, when thinking about issues more broadly. Definitely as a community organizer, my work was to ask questions, essentially, which is something that I really like doing, and to challenge people to dig deeper. And it's been beautiful to see the way that is connected to our faith. So, doing a reading of the Gospels, looking back through Jesus' teachings, Jesus had so many more questions than answers. And to me, that's inspiring, because it's calling us into this process. It's saying that faith is not about knowing something 100% for certain. It's about being in the process of discernment. And so I think for me, that process of asking questions is a lens that's really important to me, and being so focused on having the exact right answer, but really on the internal discernment. And I think the last piece just to mention is in my formation as a Sister of Providence, and as I've done reading and learning over the years, how important it's been for me to think more about the historic Jesus as a figure, and as someone who started a movement and who invited people into a public struggle, and the people that he spent time with and that he talked about. And so that always calls me deeper into thinking, if Jesus were around today, who are the people he'd be spending time with? Who are the folks that are being oppressed by our society today? And so I think that's kind of a core invitation that I always feel called back to. How am I being invited to widen the circle of my own discernment, and who should be a part of that's being impacted by actions in our public sphere today?
Our conversation, and then some of the background that contributed to that. But I really see myself as bringing a commitment to what I would term a holistic ethic of life that I see as flowing from Catholic social teaching. And for me, that has a number of components. Nonviolence is certainly a key part of that. Pope Francis, in his recent World Day of Peace message, called on all Catholics to, quote, make active nonviolence our way of life. And he emphasized that to be true followers of Jesus today includes embracing Jesus' teaching about nonviolence. I think that clearly is going to have a lot of implications as we think about broader issues in our society. Another key component of that framework would be concern for the poor and marginalized in many different forms. And I think we'll get into a number of those different issues as we go through the evening today. A third part would be care for creation, which of course has been a central theme of Pope Francis. And all of this really theologically grounded in an understanding of all people being created in the image of God, and the dignity, the rights that flow from that, and all of creation being loved by God and all the implications that flow from that. In terms of my own background, grew up in inner city Pittsburgh. From a very low-income family. My dad was on Social Security disability, and so that was the entirety of our income. So I think that sensitized me to issues around poverty. Also was an area where a lot of racial segregation and racial injustice was very apparent. There's about a half a block from kind of a dividing line between a predominantly white community and a predominantly African-American community. And so seeking to overcome those kinds of divisions has always been part of my own background. In high school, became involved in the Thomas Merton Center, an organization in Pittsburgh that was addressing issues of nuclear weapons and issues of, that was around the time draft registration had been reinstated, Central America solidarity, so got very involved in those kinds of things. Went to a Quaker college. As part of that, actually spent some time with the Gandhian community in France, led by a Catholic man. So it was kind of drawing on these various traditions and sort of deepening my understanding of them. After I graduated from college, which was Earlham College, I lived on a Catholic worker farm for a few years, which very much deepened my connection to creation in various ways as a farmer. I lived in Guatemala for a while, actually lived with a family of the relatives that disappeared. So the oldest daughter had been disappeared by the death squads, and so that experience also had a deep impact on me. A number of other things along the way, but ended up at Notre Dame for grad school, focusing on issues of Catholic social teaching, global domestic justice issues, violence, nonviolence, ecology, food ethics, the kinds of things that were mentioned earlier. And so that's the background that I bring to this conversation.
All right, thank you. I am quite challenged by this conversation, for I approached it with the premise that we believe at times that there are a significant number of Catholics who are approaching these elections with Catholic social teaching on their mind. It's challenging for me to think that way, knowing where we are in our society today, that there are most of us are approaching it from that point of view. And I'd like to invite all of us to be courageous enough to acknowledge that the lens in which we interpret life's events, it is a gift, yet at times that very gift hampers our ability to have clarity of sight. I use my own life as an example. My Southern Texas upbringing by a mother who is one of 18 siblings, and coupled with my lived experience of watching my grandparents, her parents, and her siblings go through their daily routine of working the land owned by a white landowner, for they were sharecroppers, farming cotton, tobacco, maize, raising livestock. That had a direct impact on how I see the world. And then as an adult and serving 25 years as a police officer with Cincinnati Police, that lens was severely adjusted again in ways with which I would never dream. And over the last 22 years as a permanent deacon, I through my ongoing encounter with the living God, my lens has been adjusted again and given me enough courage to try to sift out what is good and to throw away what is bad. See, part of our conversation hopefully is to acknowledge that culture and environment, how we were raised, has a direct impact on how we engage with one another, how we relate to one another. And I think that's part of the challenge for tonight, is that even if we were able to live through a lens of Catholic social teaching, we have all other culture environment that is in us that we have to intentionally address. So hopefully tonight we will begin to intentionally seek conversion, transformation that could lead us to be more faithful citizens. That the challenges there before us, that we're called to be co-creators of a beloved community, and maybe in this conversation we can begin entering toward that.
Thank you. Beautiful. I just got a message from Tim that before we continue here, that the live chat was not enabled when we started, but it is now. So if you're out there watching, if you cannot access the live chat, just go ahead and refresh your screen. Okay. All right. Okay, let's go to the first question then. What does our Catholic faith and our Catholic social teaching broadly say to us about participating in these elections right now?
If I can begin, I'm on a roll. I think I'm
You're on a roll. Go,
No.
Royce. Yep.
I think too often we have a tendency to separate Catholic social teaching from the way that we're called to live in the world. That we piecemeal everything. I remember in the late 80s, maybe the early 90s, where church leaders and those of us who may have sat in pews, we use this phrase called cafeteria Catholics, right? That the phrase was used by people, and sometimes that people was us, where we looked down on those whom we felt they were picking and choosing Catholic teaching that they would follow or not follow. It was interesting to realize that we could have been a part of a group who thought we were great witnesses of what it means to be faithful or faith-filled Catholics. All that to say is that I think we tend to compartmentalize or see Catholic teaching as separate entities rather than a whole part of living out our call to love God and love our neighbors and ourselves. So that when we bring that compartmentalization of our faith to every phase of our lives, and that includes how we participate in this election, we can take a glance at the 7 primary teachings of Catholic teaching in our church, and it's a challenge for us to see them integral to each other. I think intellectually we can get that, but how we live it out is always seems that is separate to me. So the separation of this teaching makes it more palatable to our own particular stance at any given time or in our lives, and for whatever reason we tend not to allow ourselves the space or time to discern whether we are really living out gospel values. So in this 2020, when we're pressed by a COVID virus, when we are pressed by the political, factual, the tribalism that's going on, that somehow we have to pause, allow ourselves to take a breath, and then ask ourselves, are we really engaged in this work? Does Catholic teaching really form us, or if it's something that we speak of only when someone else brings it up? I know in my own household we might talk about lots of things, but Catholic social teaching is not on the table when we're eating dinner or when we're sitting around having fun. So even I know that in my own household we could do a better job of engaging Catholic social teaching and our role to live it out and be witnesses of what God can do through our activity in this election.
Thank you, Royce. Tracey, John?
I could go next. Sure. I think what I would add, so for me, my initial reaction to this question is, well, Catholic social teaching says that you should vote. I'm thinking about, the principle of rights and responsibilities, that we have the right to vote, and that also means we have a responsibility to participate civically. And beyond the election, that before and after, we should be holding decision makers accountable, no matter what the outcome is. And I think, too, going back to just the Catholic Social Teaching 101 that I've been connected with, it always comes back to this question of the common good, which I think can be challenging for a lot of conversations around voting. People think, what is this going to do for me? What's this going to impact in life? And so many times we act out of self-interest, and that's very human. And at the same time, how can we connect that back to the common good and recognize that actually the things that are harming other people in my community, the things that are harming folks on the margins, that's not in my self-interest. And so I think, moving the conversations beyond myself into the common good is really important.
Yeah, and I would just pick up on that. So Catholic teaching does say that involvement in political life is an obligation, because it's on behalf of working for the common good. So voting is a part of that, but not the entirety, right? So we're also supposed to find other ways to be active and involved even after and between elections, getting involved in grassroots organizations, social movements, reaching out to our elected officials in various ways. There's an emphasis in Catholic teaching of the need to look at a wide range of issues in making decisions about elections. So the bishop's document, Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship, specifically says, Catholics are not single issue voters. And the document's a good example of that, because they spend 50 pages talking about a vast array of issues in the document. So looking at the issues is part of Catholic teaching on voting, but also looking at issues of character, integrity, and competence is something that's held up in Catholic social teaching. So as we think about a politician, do they seem to be about self-aggrandizement primarily, or are they truly concerned for the common good? Do they seek to foster unity, or are they sowing division in society? Integrity, do they have a reputation for telling the truth, or do they have a reputation for not telling the truth? Competence, do they show a history of dealing well with crises? These are all things that come into decision making in elections. Pope Francis adds a few other things. He says we should try to avoid politicians who show a love of money, right? So he has a quote saying, politics is not the proper place for, quote, anyone who's too attached to material things or the mere, those who love money, lavish banquets, sumptuous houses. He warns against politicians who scapegoat others, like immigrants and refugees, or racial and ethnic minorities, which was a big theme in his recent encyclicals that people will then apply to the act of voting. So Catholic social teaching sees voting as kind of a complex process, and it involves taking into account a lot of different considerations and then prayerfully considering those and making a decision.
Thank you all. This next question will allow each of you maybe to say a little more about the particular area of justice that you're representing tonight. So the question is, what social justice issues are important to Catholics when they're considering voting in this election? So we're interested in hearing about, again, racial justice, immigration justice, and climate justice.
Again, I'll reiterate that hopefully that to approach living out faith and Catholic teaching in such a piecemeal fashion is not healthy, nor does it assist us in being open to God's Spirit, which transformed mind and heart. I truly believe that we simply can't continue to take this approach to living out our profession to be holy as God is holy without doing justice, without showing mercy, and without practicing forgiveness. It still amazes me that a person could hear the cries of the poor for relief, to be unburdened from sin and the evil of racism, and that the Christian response would not be to advocate for change. That still amazes me, that people are crying in our streets, and people are dying in our families, and yet there seems to be a people who refuse to advocate for change toward justice. Certainly, that as a Christian, as a Catholic person, that we wouldn't ignore what we've seen with our own eyes, and then fail to carry out our responsibility to repair what is wrong. It is sinful. It breaks my heart, and there are just tears that continue to flow, that we live in America that where racism abounds, and there seems to be a significant number of people who seem not to have empathy or a love for God's human in which he created each good. I think in light of the coronavirus and how it has changed the way we live in the world, that to acknowledge that there's been more than 230,000 people who died from this virus in America. And we could see that number across our screen when we're watching news, and it's just a number. We don't connect it, that those are people, that those are brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers and people who are Black and white and Hispanic and those folk who are poor, and we not respond to it. How could we have such a number, and that it's impacting African Americans and other people of color more than anybody else, and our response would not be to advocate for access of health care for all Americans? How could we justify that and not be and recoil from when people call us hypocrites? That would be hypocritical to say that we stand for the dignity of life, but we fail to address an issue that's harming a people in drastic ways. And then if we can't do it or choose not to do it in this moment, when will we ever do it? How can we ever be credible in our profession to advocate and support an option for the poor and vulnerable? And even if we find within us the strength to respond, we would then have to take a stand for the dignity of work and rights of workers. Here we are in this time in 2020, where over and over again we acknowledge the privilege of those of us who are able to work from home, but we still must be willing to address the impact on the poor and the middle class who have lost or losing their place of residence due to the virus and the accompanying financial strain. We simply can't have a stance to say that we're being God's co-creators with God to seek justice when we're failing to do what's right in front of us. So that this idea of racial injustice that it's been a part of the American stream since the beginning, and here we are choosing still not to address it. We should always ask for God's forgiveness and mercy for failing to do what is right and what is just.
Thank you, Royce. John, would you like to go next?
Sure. I think there's certainly lots of crucial issues in this election, and certainly racial injustice, economic injustice, more broadly, all of that tied together with coronavirus are certainly at the core of issues. In immigration and other things that I think Tracey will be talking more about. But I think also at the core really needs to be issues of climate change, right? All other issues, in a sense, are dependent upon us having a habitable planet. And if we're truthful about what the science is telling us, if we're truthful about where the world stands, we recognize that time is short to deal with that issue in an adequate way, right? So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has said we have basically 10 years to make some very fundamental changes. We need to cut emissions in half over a 10-year period to avoid catastrophic climate change. Pope Francis has echoed this over and over again. I mean, one of his recent comments, he says, quote, "I can say to you now or never. Every year the problems are getting worse. We are at the limits. If I may use a strong word, I would say that we are on the verge of suicide." Francis understands the depth of the climate crisis. You have leading climate scientists saying if U.S. policies continue to be what they were like for the last 4 years, it's, quote, game over for the planet, because the U.S. needs to take a leadership role in addressing this issue. There's going to be a extraordinarily important meeting taking place at the end of next year if all the nations of the world come together to renew and deepen their commitments to fighting climate change. And we certainly need to, as a country, to be at the forefront of leading that. So, climate change, if we don't have a habitable planet, all the other issues that are all crucial in their own ways, become irrelevant because we no longer have, a capacity for human life, right? So I think, without neglecting all the other issues, we also need to, really see the primacy of the issue of climate change. And I think Francis has certainly pointed us to that over and over again. But I'll be happy to talk about other issues too as we go along, but wanted to foreground that as an important issue at this point in the conversation.
Sure. Thank you, John. Tracey, tell us more about immigration justice, please.
Sure. So, I think there are so many different levels for us at KBI in thinking about creating just workable migration, particularly between the US and Mexico. But we've seen really the irreparable damage that this administration has done for migrants, both in the US and outside the US. So, we've seen a record number of people detained, every day in our country, nearly 60,000 people in prison for migrating, which the church teaches is a human right to migrate, to seek a better life, to seek international protection, and to provide for their families. We've seen raids that have divided families, that have taken people who work in our communities, and in many cases sent them to a place that's no longer their home. Just the past, since I've been living here in Nogales, Sonora, since last year, seeing how people have been waiting here at the border for a right that U.S. and international law says that they have to seek protection, to seek asylum. And so, all of this, thinking about the dignity of people, when you have folks that are seeing death threats and they arrive seeking protection and instead are returned to Mexico or are asked to wait on these long metering lists for months. Now, many of them have been over a year that they've been waiting. There's no way that reflects the human dignity that the church teaches that each person has. And the many ways that it just really deteriorates other rights that people have. That we think about Catholic social teaching, people have, all of these rights to education, to seeking work, to seeking, dignified lives, and all of that is being deteriorated in the many ways that our immigration system is harming families. And so I think, one thing that I want to point out in general, a lot of these things, are not news to anyone who's probably listening tonight, but that really taking a look at how these things play out at a local level, so that concept of subsidiarity, and looking really at the most local form of decision making. So a lot of people don't think about the local sheriffs decide whether they have a contract with ICE and whether they detain people, and they decide about what those conditions are going to look like. A lot of people don't think about other local officials, the chief of police, what decision power do they have about stopping or profiling people on the street for minor traffic infractions that sometimes lead in some communities to detention and deportation, or at a state level, how are we upholding people's rights to having a valid ID or a driver's license or access to education. And so I think another thing I'd really encourage people to think about, all of those different levels of living a dignified life. How is that being represented? The things that our church really upholds, people having access to education, healthcare, dignified work, all of those things, how is that intersecting at a local and state level? And who are the people that we need in decision-making roles that will uphold the dignity of migrants in our communities?
Thank you. Thank you all so much. And Tracey, I appreciate you bringing the border to Cincinnati and making it very local, as you just reflected. Thank you. What would you say to a Catholic who is discerning the urgency or priority of various social issues or a particular issue in Catholic social teaching as they prepare to vote? So what can you say about that dilemma or that discernment?
I would begin by saying that discernment requires an intention to be open to doing things a new way, right? That true discernment requires that we're open to change. That discernment must include having an informed conscience and a willingness to act on the very spirit that moves us, that comes from God. And unfortunately, at times we approach discernment with our minds already made up. We attempt to unearth a reason to remain as we are because it's easier to do. But I encourage all of us to pray for godly wisdom. We must enter into discernment prayerfully and asking God to make known to us what we need in order to live more courageously in our world. Courageously, that in one of the church's documents, the recent pastoral letter, the bishops wrote, "Too many good Catholics fail to know the impact of racism in our daily existence." And I always say to that phrase is, how can you call yourself good and Catholic if you don't know the impact of racism in our world? See that just today or yesterday, the gospel reading talked about Jesus praying through the night as he prepared to choose 12 apostles. Jesus' example for us that it requires great effort to sift out God's voice from the many other voices that we hear. So we must have a zeal to radiate the love of Christ in everything that we say and do. And that's hard to do, but it is the challenge of faith. When we hear from scripture again that you must love the Lord God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, and with all of your strength, we would just take a deep breath. That's just too hard to do. But if we take a look at the psalmist who laments, and they do take a deep breath, and they remember the God who provides, it is then that they can find the words to remind themselves that yes, O Lord, you are God. So in this conversation, I would say we must believe that when we are faithful in our responsibility to be co-creators of justice in the here and now, we shouldn't have to wait to get to heaven to experience God's goodness on this earth. That the one who is justice acts with love and mercy, and he is the good shepherd in good times and bad. But in order to live that out, we have to seek that kind of love. We have to seek that kind of intervention. So discernment says that we are seeking God's voice, and not only we're seeking it, we're willing to be open to change. So that's the challenge in having conversation with a Catholic or a family member or whoever that may be when we're talking about doing justice and being merciful. All that flows from our relationship with God. It's just not something out in the ether somewhere, but it's something that God dwells in us, and we have to act on that love that's in us.
Thank you, Royce.
I think I might piggyback off of that as well, because I think that seeing this, civic action as an act of love, I don't remember who the quote's from, but that justice is what love looks like in public. And so I've loved seeing the Ignatian Solidarity Network's campaign about voting as an act of love. And I think really inviting us, how does that shift my perspective, or how does that shift my discernment if I consider this not as an economic calculation, or not looking at maybe GDP or just my own personal gains or taxes, but if I can think about it as like, if this is an act of love, how will I approach this discernment differently? And I think too, thinking about who are the people that I want to bring with me to the polls, to my civic life, to the decisions I make about showing up in public with my neighbors. Who are those people? What are those faces that I want to imagine as I'm entering into that discernment? And I think also, a lot of times, something that takes the pressure off for me in a discernment like this, thinking about various issues, is there's so much intersectionality. I mean, just these three issues that we're talking about today, people are migrating because of climate change, and our immigration system is warped because of racism. We treat European migrants very differently than we treat migrants from Central America and Africa. And that's not by accident, it's by design. And so, so for me, thinking about the intersectionality and really recognizing the connections between the issues and the decisions that are made in policy, how they really impact so many different issues all at once. You know, if people don't have access to healthcare, that's going to impact every aspect of their life. If people don't have access to education, that's going to impact inequality as well. And so I think that helps me ease things off a little bit when I recognize that, you know, maybe I'm going to focus on a few issues, but the reality is those issues impact other justice issues. So really keeping that intersectionality as something core to the discernment.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would say certainly seeing the interconnection of the issues is crucial. It sort of goes back to that emphasis in Catholic social teaching of what I call a holistic ethic of life, sometimes more commonly called a consistent ethic of life, but seeing the connection of all these issues as a way to enhance and support life. Certainly, you know, climate change, again, if you had to make a priority among the issues given where we are in the state of the world in relation to climate change, and that, you know, everything depends upon the continuation of a habitable planet, would certainly put that as a core issue. But as Tracey was mentioning, you know, it's deeply, deeply interconnected with issues of global poverty, with racism, with, you know, immigration issues. So there's all these interconnections between issues. And I mean, as we think about discerning priorities too, I think, especially in a Catholic context, this may be a point to bring in, you know, another part of the conversation, which is, you know, the centrality of the issue of abortion for many Catholics, which is, you know, certainly a crucial issue to, you know, to be attentive to, and as someone committed to, you know, nonviolence in a holistic way, you know, certainly understand, you know, the moral imperative of reducing abortion. You know, it's a more complex issue than it's often brought about in public in terms of, you know, what would be the policies that would be most likely to successfully reduce abortion. But I think in terms of priorities, where one issue we might want to talk about is, what does Catholic social teaching teach around whether that's the determinative issue for people's voting? Because you certainly hear many Catholics saying that, and that's actually a misrepresentation of Catholic teaching, that both the bishops and the popes have said, you know, there can be indeed circumstances where, all things considered, you may need to vote for a candidate who, you know, doesn't support the criminalization of abortion. So just to give you a couple quotes to make that clear. So this is from Cardinal Ratzinger, so Pope Benedict, before he became Pope, when he was writing as head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. He says, a Catholic would be guilty of formal cooperation in evil, and so unworthy to present himself for Holy Communion, if he were to deliberately vote for a candidate precisely because of the candidate's permissive stand on abortion and/or euthanasia. When the Catholic does not share a candidate's stand in favor of abortion or euthanasia, but votes for that candidate for other reasons, it is considered remote material cooperation, which can be permitted in the presence of proportionate reasons, right? So Pope Benedict is acknowledging, you know, there may be the circumstances where there's proportionate reasons where that isn't the determinative issue. Similarly, the U.S. Catholic bishops, in their document on forming consciences for faithful citizenship, say, quote, there may be times when the Catholic who rejects a candidate's unacceptable position, even on policies promoting an intrinsically evil act, may reasonably decide to vote for that candidate for other morally grave reasons. And so I think you can then have a conversation about, you know, what are proportionate reasons and what's morally grave. But I think it's important to set aside the idea that there is one determinative issue that the Church says has to determine voting, because that is, you know, misrepresenting what official teaching is actually saying.
Thank you, John, for that clarity. Actually, several of the questions that have been coming in as you all have been speaking have been about the sanctity of life and about the question of abortion specifically. So thank you again for that clarity and for coming prepared to respond to that very, just very, very difficult issue that people are considering. Does either of you want to add anything to that, Tracey or Royce, to John's comments?
not necessarily John's comment, but to the questions that
Okay,
people have
question.
posed to
Uh-huh.
you as it relates to sanctity of life. Is that
Okay.
as a Catholic believer, as a Christian person, sanctity of life is from conception until death, right? And that sanctity of life also is connected to the justice issues of whether people have access to what they need to survive. That too often in this conversation, sanctity of life is truly about whether or not a child is born or not. But what happens after the child is born? Where's the sanctity of life that happens within the context of living a lifetime? And and too often we have this conversation without realizing that sanctity of life is much bigger than just birth, right? That too often we leave people on their own without access. We neglect the poor. And then how can you have a dignity of life when you don't have access to make ends meet? I remember in my own life of hearing old black men, old black women who worked for the same company for 40 to 50 years and said they never took a day off. And because they understood that there was dignity in work and providing for their families. That is a quality of life, the sanctity of life that comes for every human being to have access so that we can all know what dignity is in our lifetime.
Sanctity of life in the context of what people suffer in our immigration system. So just last week, an organization we partner with accompanied a family. Well, actually, it was a family, a wife, husband, wife who had tried to seek asylum, were fleeing threats in Cuba. They were fleeing political persecution, and then arrived in Mexico and received threats and were not safe there. So when they approached the port of entry and requested asylum, the mom had actually a really high risk pregnancy, and they were really concerned about the baby. They were turned away, and so they ended up trying to cross through the desert. And were detained, and the mom was rushed to the hospital because she had gone into preterm labor, and the dad was actually deported back to Mexico. And so when we think about, if the key concern is for the family, even for the unborn, that's a really clear case where there are other policies impacting the unborn, impacting this child that was migrating, that was put in danger because of our policy, rejecting them coming to a safe place so that the mom could be safe in giving labor and giving birth, rather than having to cross days through the desert without adequate nutrition, and then having the dad returned to an unsafe situation. And so I think, the more that we can complicate and think about the dignity of people and this sanctity of life at all stages, and recognize that there are lots of ways that there is harm being done, and lots of different angles that we need to consider for the sanctity of life. I think that's important as we're doing this discernment about voting.
Thank you. Here's a question, kind of a different application of Catholic social teaching. This person's asking, how do we better integrate Catholic social teaching into the training of seminarians and into Sunday homilies in parishes on a regular basis? Royce, come on, Royce.
Let me start with in the pastoral letter, Open Wide Our Hearts, the bishop's address, that bishops and all of those who preach, priest, deacons should preach more often on social issues, right? On addressing Catholic social teaching. And what I find in the conversations throughout the diocese is that we have a number of homilists who are uncomfortable, right? Talking about that in their parishes. I've even heard the context that we have Democrat and we have Republican parishes. I don't know where that sits and how we get there, because social teaching bridges who we are, and that we can be both Catholic and Republican and Democrat and still hear the message about what it is that forms us to live justice out in the world. So, and again, it's not as if the seminarians are not receiving any teaching about Catholic social teaching, but when you are in a seminary and the environment, the culture is Eurocentric, how much are you going to be able to live that out? Or when they do their internships and they're in the large parishes rather than in the inner city or urban core or in rural parishes, how much can they actually learn, live by experience if they're not exposed? So that's the challenge I would have, is that not only what they learn in a classroom, but how can we broaden the perspective on who they minister to, which is all God's people, by giving them access to parishes and people who look different than them.
I would say this question is certainly one that my students ask all the time, is why haven't I heard this before, right? So teaching Catholic social teaching, I can't count the number of students who said, if my parish had been teaching this, I would probably still be Catholic. That they weren't hearing this kind of holistic concern for justice and care for creation and all these things sort of integrated in the way the Catholic social teaching presents it. That's not what they're often getting at the parish level. And it's, leading people away from the tradition. It's leading them to, break with their Catholic faith. And I think that's obviously really, really sad. And I always ask the students, how many of you have ever heard a homily on ecological issues? It's certainly been a central theme of Pope Francis, and it's a rare student who ever says that they have, that it hasn't, gotten integrated well into parish life. Or the depth of critique of war, for example, that recent popes have articulated. Students are often surprised how deep the critique of war is. How many deep critical questions are being raised about our economic system and capitalism. John Paul II had very deep critiques there that most people have never been exposed to, never heard of. But at least my students, when they hear them, are very, engaged, and it helps them appreciate more of the fullness of Catholic tradition when they see that all these other issues are being addressed as well. And then their question is, why isn't anyone telling us that, right? So I think that's a crucial question: is how do we integrate it better into the life of the parishes, so the fullness of what the tradition is teaching can be, passed on and understood. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think too, one thing I would just add is, for the person asking this question, or for others that are in a parish setting, how important it is for that grassroots support to exist, to enable folks in leadership positions to take those stands. So, the question too, how often are priests or pastors hearing from parishioners, could you preach about this, inviting them, I'm really interested in hearing more about what our faith has to say about immigration or racism. I'm guessing they don't hear that very often. Probably the voices that are heard the loudest are when someone does preach about immigration and, the pastor gets some angry letters about it. But how many thank yous and how many expressions of appreciation do they get? So I think, building that core of grassroots movement for those shifts, I think, of course, like there is that power dynamic that the pastor has, and every person in the pews has the power also to communicate those values and to encourage more of that dialogue in their parish.
Thank you for all those great responses. How about this one? What are 3 comfort zones that are unique to Catholics, since this is our primary viewing audience here tonight? So what are 3 comfort zones unique to Catholics that blind Catholics from changing or being open? Royce, you're talking about openness to being transformed. So what would be some dynamics or issues or these comfort zones for Catholics that might press up against any change?
The first one that comes to mind for me is liturgy. Is that we at times come not expecting to hear a prophetic voice. Sometimes we come not to hear the voice of God, that we know that we receive the body and blood of Christ. It is truly Jesus, but within liturgy, Jesus is present in so many other ways, and with so many words, so much silence, so much prayer, so much song, and yet we sometimes are seduced by this is what we expect, so we don't enter into this idea that I'm going to church to meet God today. I'm gonna hear a word that's going to challenge me. So sometimes just that routine of going to mass, and whether it be a 30-minute mass or an hour and a half mass, that sometimes we come and we're not really present to meet the very God who we come to worship and to praise, that God has done something in our life. And that's why we gather as a community to praise God for what God has already done. But too many of us at times come not expecting to meet God, right? We're going to receive God through Eucharist, but we're not going to meet the very God that's present in each other and present in the place that we call holy.
I think for me, and I'm not sure I resonate with that question of comfort zone that blinds Catholics to changes, but maybe it's more of like a limiting lens because I don't feel comfortable with it. But I would say one issue for us that's very real is patriarchy. People every week seeing a man in a place of authority in a place of leadership. I think that is a really challenging, limiting lens for us as we think about public civic life. How hesitant are you to vote for a woman when your whole life you've been seeing leadership as a role that men take on every Sunday? So we have a lot of work to do in that realm. And I think also that leads us to not considering women as much when it comes to different issues. And of course, women, when you think about it, are the most oppressed group. And many issues impact women more than men, particularly women of color. And so for me, that's a limiting lens that definitely is an issue for us as Catholics.
Yeah, sort of along both of those lines. I think you're not expecting or wanting to be challenged in liturgy and in church, and to bring kind of uncritical parts of the culture to that, whether it be an uncritical kind of nationalism that will often impact how we think about issues of war and violence in ways that go against what the Catholic teaching says, whether it be so imbuing a culture of materialism and sort of capitalist economics that we're not willing or wanting to get the deeper critical issues and hear them around that. So you're seeing going to church more as just wanting to provide kind of a respite from certain parts of the world, but not also a place to be deeply transformed and challenged. I think is that desire for, I think, even the way the question was asked me, but the desire for comfort in a sense is itself an obstacle to this deeper kind of challenge that the Catholic teaching, social teaching would present if you really opened yourself to the fullness of it.
One of the other things that came to mind for me is that sometimes we're just comfortable surrounding ourselves with people who think like us, right? It's comfortable to have a group of people that never challenge us, as John has just said, but it's comfortable, and to not have to relate to somebody different than I don't know how many times I've had to have this conversation, even with that in my role with the archdiocese, where some of my peers will say to me, "You will say some things that we won't say," and I was like, "Well, I know that." Right, that I know, but I wish that you would. Right, I wish that you would stand, and so it's a challenge of the comfort zone is staying around people just like us, right? That we never hear anything different, and as long as we're hearing it, then we feel good about where we are.
Well, Tracey, you alluded to that when you gave your opening remarks about the very wise teacher that asked you to take the other side of the issue, right, and prepare a debate from that point of view. That was very enlightened. Go ahead.
And the other thing I wanted to say, I remember learning a few years ago, maybe during my organizing training, actually, that on Sunday, the time people are in church or in their congregations, that's like the most segregated time of the week. So as you were saying, Deacon Royce, I think that's something we should be concerned about. What what kind of environment is that creating? Recognizing that we're most segregated when we're in our faith communities, when we're in our houses of worship. What does that say about how we're empowering folks to build relationship across difference, and what steps would it take for us to move beyond that?
So here's a question from someone who's been listening and watching. What gives you hope? What gives you hope in this election season, this very unique, unprecedented, yes, election season? Go ahead.
I want to speak to that. The thing that's giving me hope these days, I have the privilege of working with an amazing group of people, men, women, children, who are in the process of migrating and have formed this campaign called Save Asylum. And so there was a point during all of this, the metering, and then when the borders were closed off to asylum seekers in March, folks that have just been waiting without an end in sight. And one of the migrants commented, well, shouldn't we do something? Shouldn't we say something? And if we don't say something, who will speak for us? And so every month we've been having a public action binationally with folks from both sides, and seeing the migrants telling their stories unrelentlessly and showing up over and over again, demanding the rights that they know that they have access to, and really bearing witness to their dignity as children of God is beautiful. And I know that that's rooted in a deep faith from a lot of the conversations that we've had and prayers that we've had together. So that's something, seeing that strength in the face of so much adversity, and knowing that strength and that just the beauty of that will continue regardless of what happens on November 3rd is giving me hope.
Yeah, beautiful.
I would say for me, especially as a teacher of college students, that young people give me hope. And we've certainly seen that with issues like climate change, where it's been, the youth who have often been in the forefront of that movement around the world, and seeing the positive ways that students respond to being exposed to the fullness of Catholic social teaching and things like that is certainly a hope-giving thing. The tradition itself, Pope Francis, certainly inspires much hope. I would also say on a kind of deeper level, kind of contemplative practice is a source of hope, or a recognition that even in the midst of the brokenness of the world, that there is a deeper wholeness of love and compassion that we can get in touch with through prayer and meditative practices of various kinds that can give us support as we face the challenges and the brokenness that's so extremely evident in our world. So I think all of those and other things are things that give me hope. Just seeing the social movements arising all around the world. So just in the last few days, I don't know how much people follow what's going on in Latin America, but in Chile, for example, they finally succeeded in planning to rewrite their entire constitution from what had been put in place by the Pinochet dictatorship. It was the culmination of many years of struggle, again, largely led there by young people as well. But seeing these examples and successful nonviolent revolutions that have taken place all around the world in so many countries, and that are continuing to go on right now, all of those are sources of hope. Amidst also, of course, the deep reasons for concern for social justice and ecology and all those things that's also very much present.
It has given me great hope as I minister in the Archdiocese of Cincinnati and at the parish level, that there are men and women, young people who have a heart for justice, who are willing to be active participants in creating a better world. It gives me hope that there are people who are walking in our streets across of America, and they're convicted by seeing the heartache, and they respond. It's a hope that gives me hope that people have taken to the streets of this America to speak loudly. The other thing that gives me hope is faith. Is as I come to understand and believe that no matter what happens on election day, God is still going to be God. God has a plan. And that doesn't mean that since God has a plan that we're not active participants, but being active participants, God will do what God does. And I truly believe that God will see us through no matter what happens.
Thank you for that confident voice of faith. So that's a good transition into this, maybe a closing question. How do you think we can bring our faith to the post-election period? No matter what happens, as you say, restoring hope, working for justice, building bridges. I think each of you has mentioned that Catholic social teaching is about how we live our faith before, during, and after elections. So the election's over. We have a new opportunity, a new beginning. What could that look like, do you think?
I think for me, if each one of us would make a commitment to do one thing, to act on one thing, to do justice about something, right? That too often we take a look at the big picture and we feel overwhelmed that we can't do anything. But if each one of us would make a commitment that I'm going to change how I live in the world and seek justice in one tangible way and live that out, right? That if we make that list too long, we probably won't do any of them. But if we could remain committed to do one thing and whatever that would be for an individual, as opposed to we're all going to do this, that we would enter into discernment and say, as we move forward post-election, how am I going to change? How am I asking God to remove from me that which challenge me, that stops me from being a better person, from loving my neighbor? So that's what I would ask.
Great, thank you.
I would say, to piggyback off of that, Deacon, to choose one thing. The one thing I would encourage is to meet with someone, whether it's a member of Congress or your mayor or the sheriff who just won. Meet with one of those people who won in your district, in your region, whether it was the person you voted for or not. I think sometimes people forget that whether you voted for them, they have a responsibility to you as a constituent, and you have a responsibility to them to inform them about the issues. So first of all, being informed personally, and then I'm always so surprised that elected leaders really don't know. Often we're the experts that are coming in and teaching them about what's going on in our communities. So making a commitment to reach out to one elected official who won the election and show up with your priorities, with your stories, and the communities that you represent and that you want to fight with.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I think certainly a key concern is going to be how to address the so evident divisions of society, how to work for reconciliation. Hopefully we have leadership that's also committed to working for reconciliation. I think finding ways to address a lot of the misconceptions that have been part of the campaigning, that I think there's just a lot of falsehoods that are going around about what people's views and positions are on different issues, and helping people to get beyond those in the aftermath of the election. I think there's also going to be a crucial role for the church and people of faith in dealing with what seems almost certain to be extraordinarily difficult circumstances surrounding the election itself, right? I mean, it's, who would have ever thought we'd be in a context where people of all political parties are saying we're not sure about a peaceful transition of power. And so many people committed to nonviolence, for example, are training for what does it look like if you have to intervene to prevent kind of a usurpation of power, or in a sense a kind of coup in the U.S. political context, as at least a potential scenario. I think there's going to be, if that kind of scenario develops, the church is going to have to take a strong and prophetic stand in that context, right? So for reconciliation, there may need to be these other things that come to get us through the immediate crisis that we could be facing. Hopefully, it doesn't come to that, but certainly something to be attentive to and to be preparing to think, how would we respond in that kind of circumstance? And so something to ponder for a few days.
And a call to prayer in any case, right? We should all be on our knees, I think, for the next week. Any final thoughts that any of you would like to offer to people listening? Some have already voted, some not yet. But any last wisdom?
I'll add something. Really, what John said, that the church needs to speak. I guess the question is, what does the church have to say, right? What does the church, and it's a lot. What does the church has to say through its documents? But what does the church has to say prophetically in the here and now? That, and even if the church doesn't speak, meaning that the leader of the church, whether it be the archbishop, the bishop, or the pastor, that we each have a prophetic voice, and that prophetic voice that may make some change may be ours. So we have to form our voice, form our mind, so that we can speak into existence a justice that happens now, that we can participate in. So may we use the strength that is in us to use our voice to bring about change. This is what I'll add to that.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I think we're
Go ahead, Tracey.
Thanks. I think I would say too, this is a really hard moment for so many people for so many reasons, between the pandemic and unrest, and just, so many injustices that have been happening for years finally coming to the limelight in a real way. So I just really encourage people to have self-compassion, to cling to those practices, that the contemplation, practices that connect you to God and to other people that are life-giving, and to be compassionate to others. I think this is just a moment, the next couple of weeks are going to be really difficult no matter what. So I think centering that compassion for others is going to be really important.
and I would say, if people are still in discernment mode and haven't read Pope Francis's recent encyclicals, that would be a great place to start. Laudato Si, Fratelli Tutti, and prayerfully consider what all is there, and think, how does that play out in this particular context that we're in. That would be a wonderful thing for people to do, and to take that into prayer.
Thank you so much, each of you. This has been a really wonderful conversation. You've helped us explore our faith, Catholicism, our sense of social justice, our involvement in this election. And thank you to all those who have joined us through this live stream. This recording will continue to be available on the Bellarmine Chapel YouTube channel, so you can encourage others to take a look at it. Please make sure that you have your own plan to vote, and take your loved ones with you to do that as well. And this was not in my script, but I think I can add this, that the next event for our collaborative Bellarmine Chapel and the Institute for Spirituality and Social Justice event will be Monday, November 30th, when Jillian Algren will talk on Fratelli Tutti, the new letter just that has come from Francis, so that we can all look forward to that together. So God bless us all. Thank you for panel for being here, and for all of those who are watching. So peace and all good. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thanks so much. Take care.